Welcome to another episode of I Catch Killers. We've had plenty of people on this podcast who have spent time in prisons, locked up for all types of offences. But we've never had someone that's been locked up for spying. That's something new for us. Well, today we're talking to one of the most unlikely prisoners you'll ever get to meet. Someone who spent 650 days in one of Southeast Asia's most notorious prisons. We're talking to an economist, Turnell. He's an honorary professor of economics at Macquarie University and former economic advisor to Myanmar's state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, how this mild-mannered economist came to be locked up in Myanmar, which is a fascinating story in itself, especially because he didn't do anything wrong. How he survived and came out with such a positive attitude and a view on life is also amazing, and this is his story. Turnell, welcome to I Catch Killers.
Thank you very much, Gary. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Now, I suppose you're thinking this is a true crime podcast called I Catch Killers. I got to say, I've had a lot of people sitting opposite me that have spent significant times in prison. You don't seem to fit the stereotype. I'm not seeing the tattoos or the gold bling.
Absolutely, mate. In fact, the whole title of the book gives that away, right?
Yeah.
And I think as I open it, when people heard that I've been arrested in Myanmar and put in this prison, it was sort of like, Sean, no, hang on, there must be some mistake. So, yeah, I think that perception's pretty accurate.
Okay, because it's an audio, so if people are looking, they're probably wondering who this is. Your book, Unlikely Prisoner, it is an apt name for a book and your circumstances that found you in there. I want to talk about your life. I want to talk about how you got to Myanmar, where you were incarcerated. But just tell us about the day that you got arrested. We won't go into the full details of that. We'll cover it, but just the impact it had on you. So what were you doing on the day?
So, huge day, 6th of February 2021, 5 days after a military coup in Myanmar. I woke up, saw an email that said, Sean, military intelligence and police have taken over the building. It's time to get out. And I thought, okay, they've come for me. What do I do?
Yeah. And you went down and, like a law-abiding citizen that you are, you went to the checkout counter to pay for your room.
Exactly, Gary. What I should have done is gone out a back entrance somehow and got my way to the Australian Embassy. But instead, economist that I was, I went down into the lobby, handed over my credit card to pay the bill. And as I'm doing that, the military intelligence guys and all that form in behind me.
Yeah. Did you have a sense that might have been going to occur?
I did. I was hoping that it wouldn't, but it was going that way.
Yeah.
And I was getting some warnings from other embassy people and all that, Sean, get out. But the trouble was, this is the middle of COVID. No flights, no scheduled flights out. So just about all the flights were those emergency evacuation things, every seat booked. As it turned out, in a couple of days, I would have been able to get a seat. So, yeah, but too late, though.
And you're over there. You'd been working there for a couple of years or five years as an economic advisor.
That's right, eh?
To the elected government.
That's right. Yep.
And then there was a military coup, a takeover 5 days before, and all of a sudden you had a target on your back.
That's right.
Yeah. I don't know how you would feel. Like I think it for a lot of people, and people that we've had here, people sitting in the seat you've sat in, they've chosen to live a life of crime, and consequences, and the rest is consequences of that. I don't think people fully understand having your freedom taken away from you like that when you all of a sudden haven't got control of your own destiny.
Absolutely, mate. And to say I was a law-abiding citizen, up to that point, or including that point.
You've changed now. I knew it. This is going to be a scoop.
Would under-exaggerate things, and I never even had a parking ticket.
Yeah.
So the idea that I would be sort of banged up in this prison, one of the notorious prisons in Asia, is just unthinkable. But to have one's freedom taken away, and also, I'd been a university professor, advisor to the civilian government there, so I was used to people being, very polite, and I was very polite back, and so the idea of sort of being manhandled and handcuffed and all that, like, oh my goodness, just beyond my horrified imaginings.
In those situations, the niceties tend to go out the door, the politeness, and we're talking a military takeover, so it's going to be pretty. And we'll talk about what happened when you're inside in prison, but it's a real strict authority. You do this, and I would imagine there'd be guns everywhere and all sorts of intimidating things.
Absolutely, mate. I remember the police car driving us away. There was like a police van in front of us with these guys with the AK-47s, like a sort of sharpshooters. And yeah, to be the subject of a gun is really, again, just extraordinary. I wouldn't have seen a gun except for a movie,
Yeah.
but to have it directed as me, yeah, unthinkable.
You didn't consider yourself a dangerous felon at
No,
that stage.
no.
Okay, well, look, I'm getting the sense that you're not a spy, but it was almost akin to, the arrest was about to perhaps being a foreign spy there. What were you doing in Myanmar?
Yeah, good question. I wasn't a spy, but I was there.
How could you tell?
Well,
We've actually had a spy on here, and they're very good. So maybe you were a spy.
well,
Maybe.
indeed, mate,
Yeah.
and yeah, that's right. If I was a spy, I wouldn't go around admitting it, right?
Exactly.
So,
Okay. Well, we'll work out where the truth lies.
About the only answer I can say to that, though, mate, is that if I was a spy, I wasn't very good, right? Because
Yeah.
I got caught. So, but no, I was over there advising the civilian government that was led by the 1990 Nobel Peace Prize winner, Aung San Suu Kyi, who I'd got to know many years before, and she'd invited me over to come over and give him a hand.
Yeah.
And all of that role supported by the Australian government, so part of an aid program to Myanmar. Yeah, so I'd spent much of the last 5 years there, and all going, the usual ups and downs of a country like that, trying to escape from, decades of military rule before then, and trying to find its way. And but never expected to come up against the military in that way.
Yeah. Because you saw yourself, your role over there, you were helping the country, and you were looking at their economics. I think you'd even written a book about Myanmar and the economy there. Is that correct?
Absolutely, mate. I'd spent about 30 years studying Myanmar as just part of my academic work, and I'd written a book about the country's financial history, actually sort of like a history book with a little bit of analysis of where the country had gone wrong under previous military regimes and so on. So, so my academic work very much centred on Myanmar. This was an effort, in a sense, to put all of that into actual practice, into policy practice.
Yeah. So when what struck your interest in the country in the first place?
Oh, good question, mate. And as usual, anything to do with Myanmar or Burma, as it was once known as well, totally by accident. So when I was first starting out as an academic, I lived in a share house, just at Annandale, nearby, actually. And one of my housemates was from Burma. She'd been forced to flee many years earlier. They got to know, obviously she knew I was an economist. She knew lots of people in the opposition movement, the democracy movement. They said, Sean, can you give us a hand to do some analysis of where the country's going wrong? How can we make things better if democracy was ever to come back? So I got just deeper into the country, and it's one of those things when you start, particularly for Myanmar, actually, once you start getting into it, it's a country that can very quickly grab your attention and love, basically. So, completely fell in love with the place, mate. And then, my whole life sort of just became deepening involvement. Got to know Suu Kyi. You mentioned that book, Gary. One of the more bizarre things about that, mate, was that even though it's a financial history, doesn't sound like the sort of thing that would go on the radio, but it did. The BBC Burmese service broadcasted Aung San Suu Kyi at this point, so this is the early 2000s, she's still under house arrest, but she's listening to it.
Right.
And she's thinking, gee, who's this guy? So then when she was finally released from house arrest, she got in contact with me and we began a correspondence and all of that. So I got, just ever deeper connections, if you like, with that opposition democracy movement.
Wow. She and I just bring you back to you go to Myanmar and you fall in love with the country. My son actually worked over there for 12 months, and this was prior to your arrest, and probably 12 months before that. He loved the people and just said it was such a beautiful country. But the history of the country is quite fascinating. There's a lot of conflict there. Do you want to just talk a little bit about the history of the country, just to put it into context, the environment we're talking about that you found yourself in?
Yeah, so Myanmar, and again Burma as it was called before 1988, big country, 55 million people. It's the biggest country on mainland Southeast Asia, squeezed between China and India. And that's important, actually, in terms of its history. So if people think about the place, it's a bit of a mix between China and India in all sorts of ways, from cuisine to language and all sorts of other stuff. Very troubled history. So part of the British Empire from the 1800s all the way up to World War II, then gets independence around the same time as India, just after World War II, but then immediately falls into civil war. So it's a collection of different ethnic groups.
Yep.
There's a dominant group called the Burma, from which we get the name Myanmar and Burma, but many other groups as well. So civil war takes place. This is a time, of course, of great ferment internationally, the Cold War. So you've got sort of communists and capitalists fighting each other. Eventually, the military have a coup. And they then rule on and off for the next few decades. So highly troubled country, long history of military involvement, terrible atrocities and things like that, which really stands out because, exactly as you said, very incredibly gentle people, the most generous and compassionate people I know, and yet just ruled dreadfully its whole modern history, basically.
I had someone on here who was a war crimes investigator that had worked across the world, and he said some of the most horrendous things that he saw happened in Myanmar.
Yeah.
And it just sort of, you can't equate with the image of the place, but then the sheer violence. There's racial conflict about the Muslims and Buddhism, and that seems to be a large part of the conflict as well.
Absolutely, mate. So there was a terrible series of atrocities that actually have taken place for a long time, but came prominently back in about 2017. One of the biggest problems of Myanmar's military is that, so even though most people in Myanmar are Buddhist, but there's substantial numbers of Muslim people and Christians and other groups. The trouble with the military is that it indoctrinates the troops into what I can only describe as a sort of very violent ideology, which interestingly is based on the Japanese Imperial Army of World War II.
Which were renowned for their brutality.
Absolutely, mate. So that whole code of Bushido, but the worst aspects in that, not the noble parts of it, that's very deep in the culture, all the way to the present day of the military. So, those aspects of Buddhism where, you wouldn't equate that with violence, pushed aside by this other ideology and painting Muslims, but Christians as well, as being non-Burmese and almost therefore non-human. And so you can kill them, and that's where the savagery comes from.
Desensitises them.
Absolutely.
So you're dealing with Aung San Suu Kyi.
Yep.
How did you find her? Because she's like a high profile, and she was a Nobel Peace Prize Award winner.
She's an extraordinary person, incredibly strong. And we might come to, just how she supported me in the prison, because I was on trial with her. She was one of my co-defendants.
Co-offender.
And
we're going to talk about your criminal record shortly.
Indeed.
Yeah, we just want to set the scene with who you are before you turn bad.
I'm glad it's not missed. Incredibly strong person. Very much in the country, a revered figure, an icon. Goes beyond politics. Like, she would be seen by many people in Myanmar as a sort of almost mother redeemer sort of figure that, transcends all sorts of other things. But having said that, and this is where I think many people in the West sort of got her wrong, particularly when things started to go a little awry. And, people would say things like her halo slipped and all that sort of stuff.
And that's because of what was happening in the country under her when she was in a position of power.
That's right. Although it probably will come to, she never ever had control over the military, but but absolutely. But the interesting thing about that, mate, she used to push back both then, but reflecting her previous comments across many years, she said, "Look, I'm not an angel. I'm a politician, and I need to compromise, etc. from time to time." So, and she did, during the whole time I was there. But over, some of those events we mentioned earlier against the Muslims in Rakhine State, there was a lot of things she was doing on in the background, some of which I talk about in the book, because it was part of the reason that I was imprisoned, was that we were trying to do a number of strategies to try and weaken the power of the military against, the atrocities that they were committing.
Okay. And with the... at the time, they had the election, and she was elected to power, but they wouldn't let her be. She couldn't become the president of the country because she had children to a foreigner. Is that the circumstances there?
Absolutely, mate.
and
So
created a position for her.
exactly, and so a very clever guy, this man called U Ko Ni, who was a friend of mine, identified in the Constitution a sort of get-out clause, if you like,
Yep.
a flaw in this military constitution that was designed to keep her from power, wouldn't allow her to become president, but he was able to see in the Constitution how he could create the title of state councillor. So she grabbed that title and became the effective leader.
Okay. Now, that's when did the coup, the military coup, take place? That just before your arrest. What was the build up to that? Could you see the writing on the wall?
Partly.
Yep.
So the coup took place on 1st of February 2021,
Yep.
and it was in the lead up to the Suu Kyi's government coming in for a second term.
Which
So
she won in a landslide.
won in a landslide,
Yep.
but just like in America, you have the election and then the second term doesn't begin until a couple of months later.
Yep.
So we're in that period, and also just like in America, the military didn't accept the result, even though it was absolute landslide. But they were making all sorts of claims about fake voters and all the sort of stuff again that Donald Trump was running
It
out.
seemed, because it was around the same time, and it came out in your book, that it was paralleling what was going on in America, and it almost gave it a sort of legitimacy what was happening in Myanmar.
It was terrible to see,
Yep.
Gary, because I'd be literally reading, the Washington Post, etc., about what's going on in America and these outrageous comments of Donald Trump, and then almost to see their mirror image from these military figures in Myanmar. So the tension is rising, and the government was due to take office on the day of the coup, 1st of February 2021, second term starts.
Okay.
Yep, and so a real drumbeat leading up to that.
And there was a time where you were going to go meet with her, but she suggested you might not. That was right close to the lead up. She was worried about what was occurring.
Absolutely, mate. So
Talk us through that.
Yeah, so a few days before the coup and before the second term, I was due to travel up from Yangon, which is the major city in Myanmar, up to this bizarre capital city called Naypyidaw, which is where she was. And I was due to come up there just after the second term began and the parliament would reopen and all that. And I got in contact with her, and she was always Dorsu to me, as a sort of honorific way of using her name. So I said, "Oh, look, Dorsu, I'm going to come up on Monday, and it'd be great. We'll meet up and all that." And she said, "Oh yeah, Sean, look, just hang back a little bit. That there are rogue elements of the military out on the roads at the moment. Nothing too much to worry about, but they might give you a bit of a hard time because they'll know who you are, etc. So look, just hold off a bit and come up on the Wednesday, which would have been from memory, the 3rd of February.
Okay.
And we'll have a big reunion and we'll talk about the new economic plan, which I'd sent her and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, so we'd arranged all that. And then, of course, the coup takes place in between times.
Okay, and you made reference to the fact that it was around the COVID lockdowns and different things, so it wasn't easy to get out of the country. Do you regret, or in hindsight, I think it's fairly obvious that you probably wish you did get out of the country, but was there an opportunity for you to get out of the country because other people were saying maybe it's not a safe place for you after the coup?
It's a great question, mate, and it goes over my mind still.
Yeah.
Because I was a little bit too complacent, to be honest, at the beginning. I thought as a high-profile foreigner, they're not going to touch me. Yeah, and it didn't make any sense, didn't make any logic. So I thought, it'll be okay. I was also very much, it's funny, this was much more important at the time than it seems since. It seems ridiculous now, but very strong feeling of not wanting to desert my Burmese friends.
Okay.
Not wanting to be the foreigner on the first plane.
Take the easy path out. I'm in it instead of I'm in it here with you.
Exactly, mate. So, real sense of guilt about that. So, almost, if I think about it in retrospect, subconsciously, I'm deliberately dilly-dallying around for a couple of days, and that proved my undoing, really, because so even though the flights were all booked, as I mentioned earlier, I probably could have gotten a car and got to the border with Thailand and got through, I think.
Yeah.
But, yeah, for a number of reasons, mate, I thought that they're probably not going to, come after me. I also thought, again, which is funny it sounds odd in retrospect, I thought the coup would fail because the young people especially, but lots of Burmese people, just all come out on the streets demanding that this...
Power of the people.
Yeah, exactly. And millions of people came out. And so, and again, wouldn't it have looked terrible? Here I am, the government's main economic advisor, fleeing on the first flight.
Yeah.
Then the coup ends, say, and the government reforms, and suddenly I'm looking, just terrible.
Yeah.
So,
oh, you're back, are you?
yeah, exactly. So for all those reasons, mate, at the time, it seemed like the right
felt
decision.
like the right decision.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, with the we started off with you talking about when you got that message when you're in your hotel room. Was that who sent the message to you that you should get out? Because it was basically to the point that you've got the military down there, they're keeping an eye on your room, you should get out of here.
Yeah, so I don't know who they were
Yep.
to the present day. Eh?
Yep.
So, but I owe them big time, although I guess I wasn't able to act on it.
Sean, you would have owed them if you acted like a true spy and went down the fire escape, destroyed your computer, that type of stuff that you're meant to do.
Absolutely, mate. No, that's true.
You're not going to cut it in spy school,
No,
I'm afraid.
no, that's right, mate.
Go down and pay the bill. Like,
No, absolutely true, mate. But anyway, they sent me the warning, I didn't quite act on it, as you say, mate, in the way a spy might.
okay. Well, you're there. You've been taken into custody. Now, you contacted the Australian Embassy, who sent someone out. I think you contacted your wife. This is why you're down in the foyer before. It's just sort of building up. Did you have a sense of the imminent danger that you're in or the predicament that you're in at that time, or did you think it was going to be a matter, I'll make the calls, there'll be a bit of sticking your chest out, huffing and puffing, and then they'll let me go? What was going through your mind?
That's exactly my thought, mate. So I'm still complacent, but I'm frightened. I wouldn't, I don't want to downplay that because, again, I'd never been in conflict with the law in any way, and people all around me with guns and all the rest of it. So I'm scared, but probably at a maximum, I thought they're gonna frighten me. This is the purpose of it, is to send a fright through me, but through me to all the foreigners. That you guys are not exempt, sort of thing. So at a maximum at this point, I'm thinking, okay, look, they might rough me up even a little bit or put me in a cell for a few days, a few hours, etc. But certainly no view at that point that it was going to be long term. And I had the Australian ambassador with me.
Yep.
So, in response to my call, she comes flying in the Australian government car with a flag on the bonnet and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, this is going to be awful, but in a few days, maximum, I'm going to be okay.
And the mindset that you had too, you hadn't done anything wrong, so
that's exactly right, mate. That's absolutely true. The only thing is, Gary, one aspect to that though, because I was working with the government and I had lots of sensitive things that we were working on, totally authorised, I hasten to add. I was, appointed by that government. But it did worry me that I had that stuff on me. Because at a number of levels, firstly, whether they could use it against me, of course, but also I didn't want them to have it. I mean, these were military guys who were after my friends in the democratic government, and I thought, I don't want to have any evidence that the military could use to, as I say, get at my friends.
Them or get at you.
Yeah, so I was a little bit worried about that.
From there, they've taken you away.
Absolutely, mate. Taking me away.
So it wasn't sort of. Could you take your gear? Were you handcuffed? What happened? I understand. Like I was a cop for over 30 years, so I know what it's like seeing someone arrested and what they're going through. But this is a foreign country, even though it was like a home to you. But it's a military coup, so there's a little bit more tension, a little bit higher at stake when you've been placed into custody. Talk us through that.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And I was so nervous. I remember at one point they made me sort of pack clothing for a few days in my little wheelie bag, that the plain size ones. And I remember as I'm stuffing the clothes into it, just trying to concentrate so that my hand wouldn't shake.
Not to show.
Yeah, not to show. But you're absolutely right though. All the accoutrements of military and policing around me, even to the extent, one of the things I remember, but you would remember this really well, the way that policemen shelter the top of your head as they're pushing you in the...
That's our first lesson in the police academy.
And I remember noting it at the time, and I thought, Oh gosh, this is like an episode of Law and Order.
I still to this day don't know why we do it, but all police do it. It seems it must be, I don't know what happens. Something they've convinced us down the academy. Put your hand on the back of their head as you place them in the car.
So it's all those things, mate. So it wasn't until a few hours later that I got handcuffed and things like that. But yeah, all the other stuff, even just seeing the truncheons and the pistols, and I mentioned the AK-47s and so on. So yeah, the whole imagery all around me was
we're laughing at it, and I think sometimes when you're in a situation like that, you've got to see some light in the darkness of what's happening. But I just want to read a quote out from your book, because I think this will put it in perspective what we're talking about here, the type of person you were or are, and what you're going through. And this is a quote from your book. As someone who had struggled to achieve a certain level of esteem and respect, who had worked hard to achieve the highest education qualifications available, and as someone who regarded himself as a responsible, reflective global citizen, the idea of being locked up in a cage was beyond shocking. I was always frightened and scared. Understandable.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. And also the juxtaposition to the way that I'd always interacted with people in Burma or in Myanmar, because the people are incredibly gentle, incredibly respectful, because people in Myanmar revere education. And
Right.
I'm there as a professor, but also known as a friend of Daw Suu. And so the turnaround from that, absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, my son said that the teaching, the pedestal that they were put on, because that's what he was doing over there. He was doing some teaching over there, and they said they were revered as a teacher.
Interesting, Gary.
Yeah.
So he'd be familiar with it. So as a teacher, you're given the title of sire,
Yeah.
which is a little bit like the Japanese thing of sensei. So it's more even than teacher. It's a real reverence for the teacher.
Yeah, interesting. So what happened after your arrest? So where were you taken? You bundled into a car, making sure that you didn't hit your head on the way in, which is important.
So taken first to a local police station that is absolutely chock-a-block full of young protesters.
Yeah.
So all the people have been out there on the streets. So the arrests had started by then. So really young people making an enormous racket in the jail. So initially taken there, and a few of them sort of knew who I was and were shouting out encouragement and all that. There was almost like a festive air at this point, because so even though they'd started arresting, the military hadn't been shooting people at this point. That would come a few days later. Almost a festive atmosphere there. But then I was taken into a horrible place that I called the box very soon after that.
Talk us about that experience and just break it down, because I don't think people can fully understand what we're talking about here, how that would impact on you. Talk us through it.
Yeah, so after the initial police station, but just normal police, I'm then taken away to the headquarters of the detective sort of thing.
Yeah.
But again, in a country like Myanmar where the law doesn't apply, to glorify them with the name of detectives sort of miss things a little bit. But anyway, taken off to the detectives' headquarters, CID, as they called it. And it's right outside the notorious prison in Yangon called Insane Prison.
Yeah.
So detective headquarters right outside there. In those headquarters, I'm put in a room that I called the box. It looked like and felt like being locked in a shipping container, and basically that size, the small shipping container. No windows, no fresh air or anything like that. Just a small slit window for the people to be able to look inside at me. What was really horrifying is that nothing in the room at all, except for a metal chair that was bolted down to the centre of the room with chains attached to the chair and ankle and wrist cuffs.
Sending a chill up my spine just thinking about being placed in a room like that. That doesn't seem warm and friendly.
No, not at all, mate. And so I'm put in there, and of course, it looks like a medieval torture chamber.
Yeah.
And I thought, my God, what are they going to do to me here? As it turned out, that would be my home for the next 2 months, because I was actually just locked in this box, completely isolated. The embassy doesn't know where I am. Nobody knows where I am. And just kept in that place, had to sleep there, etc. For the next 2 months.
And what was the purpose of keeping you there? Was you went through interrogation? Was that part of what happened in?
It sure was. I think it was to intimidate me and soften me up and so on.
Oh, you weakie, you get intimidated by that. What a softy you are.
Indeed.
I'd certainly be intimidated. That's not a good look. So
No.
okay, so that you're in there. What was your day to day? 2 months you're in a
Yep.
box. How did you occupy yourself, and what were they doing with you when you were in the box?
So the biggest problem is just the length of time just on your own, because
Yeah.
you stew in your own anxiety, you know. So that's almost the worst of it. But then the interrogators would come in, and at any time, completely arbitrarily, very often in the middle of the night, 2 and 3 in the morning. Not that I knew whether it was day or night anyway, because of course I'm in this box. There's no natural light at all. So after probably about 4 days, I completely lost any sense of whether it was day or night anyway. And of course that's also part of it, you know. And they mix up the meals, and so you just feel completely disoriented. And then they come in and interrogate. And often the questions were also, you know, consistent with that, trying to disorientate. So the questions were sometimes really absurd, and also, you know, just shouted accusations. And it was at that moment where I was first called a spy. You know, that they said, "We know who you are. We know that you work for George Soros, that you work for the IMF, but you're really, behind all of that, you're a spy with MI6." And I always remember that particularly because it was never ASIO, never the CIA. It was always MI6.
Is that a throwback from the British occupation? Is that?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Gary, there is an obsession amongst the military in Myanmar that, notwithstanding the way that the world has changed, the world is run by Westminster and London. That's where it's all run from. All the threads lead back to
Have
that.
they kept up with the royal family?
I mean, the royal family to them are sort of, the ultimate oppressors still.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in there. You're getting for 2 months, and people are coming in, and I would imagine the line of questioning, and you've said like the disorientation, mixing up meals. Hadn't thought about that, but certainly the time and coming in at the middle of the night. Did they get physical?
They did, yeah, and that was quite shocking. In some ways, my treatment physically in that way, like violence, was nothing compared to my Burmese colleagues, you know, who had electrodes attached to them and savagely beaten and things like that. So the worst physical treatment I got was sort of like a slap across the head, but even that actually was more serious than it sounded. There was no force in it, but it sort of whacked my ear, and you know those times where you get that percussion effect and you get really dizzy. And I'm chained into the chair when this happens, and I can't see behind me, and this blow come from behind. And then one of the other interrogators, again a military intelligence guy, trying to scare me by lighting a cigarette lighter to the back of my head and sort of singe my hair and so on. But yeah, so obviously all that's pretty awful, but it's almost awful for what the way it plays on your mind. Because the other thing I should mention is that I'm hearing other prisoners, like Burmese prisoners, being tortured in nearby places, which to this day, actually, I'm not exactly sure where, but I could hear that. And so, you know, both my own mistreatment, which still was, you know, short of what they were suffering, but it sort of set a pattern. And I thought, oh gosh, you know, is this coming for me?
Psychologically, the threat of the torture can be, and I've spoken to people who've been in some difficult situations like that, and the threat is often worse than, if I'm going to be tortured, just get it over and done with. So
Absolutely.
you're in here, you've got an active mind, obviously, with the work that you do, and all of a sudden you're placed in this, caught up in your own thoughts and all this going on around you. Like when you said you hear people being tortured, you could hear the screams.
Yep. Absolutely. And then later on I was to meet them actually in the prison later, you know, to skip forward a bit. But just to, like, I saw the proof of it, you know, the scars, etc. This powder they had to put on their backs where they'd been whipped and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And at that time when you're sitting there, I'm just picturing it with your ankles shackled, your hands shackled, and you're vulnerable to anything. What did they want to get from you? What were they trying to get the admissions about?
So a couple of things. Yeah, so first it was just to soften me up, but then it became very clear that they were trying to use me to implicate Aung San Suu Kyi and the other government ministers. So I quickly cottoned on that they were trying to set me up for being a spy, effectively, but that also, most importantly, that Aung San Suu Kyi, the ministers of the civilian government, were patsies of mine, you know, and that I was pulling the strings.
You're the Mr. Big.
I was the Mr. Big, and that they were doing things at sort of my behest. Yeah.
And the answers, there was one extract in the book where you talk about one of the interpreters, I think it was, said, keep your answers short. Were people playing with your mind, or do you think there was some people in there trying to do the right thing by you?
There were some people trying to do the right thing, and particular this guy. He was genuinely trying to help me. He actually said to me, when the others had left the room, he turned to me and said, Sean, look, your answers are too long. You're overcomplicating things. These guys don't know anything. Just keep it brief. Don't try and explain things. But as I say in the book, I was a little bit, I wouldn't say arrogant. I just, very low levels of trust, obviously. And the natural reaction is to defend yourself, So I partly took his advice, but not enough, to be honest.
Yeah. And I suppose in the line of work that you've been in, and a university lecturer, anything can be explained. Stop, just listen, I'll explain it. But that wasn't cutting it with these guys.
Totally, Gary. But my whole life had been about that you could talk and reason through everything, and particularly in economics, right? And that you have that sort of assumption that people are basically rational. But that wasn't the case.
What was going through your mind thinking what's been done on the outside for me? Did you think that you'd just been forgotten? Or because you didn't have, as I understand it, when you're in the box, you didn't have any access to the embassy or any legal advice?
No, that's right. But, one of the upsides, I always knew that I wasn't on my own. I knew that my wife would be making one hell of a ruckus outside. So I knew that. I also, because I'd, read stories before of people like this, I thought, Australia's not going to stand for this. This is really going to hit the airwaves. Yeah. So I never felt abandoned at all, even though, for that most of that 2 months, I had no contact whatsoever. But I thought, okay, there's going to be people really coming in behind me.
Yeah. And the way that you handled the interrogation, I had a bit of a chuckle, made reference to the fact that you'd read some spy novels and, okay, this is how you handle. Were you playing games with them? Like they're clearly playing games with you. You've got a smart brain. Were you sort of flipping it back on them a little bit?
Totally was. Yep. So, sometimes it was just trying to explain stuff. Sometimes, and this almost sounds a little bit mean, I would sort of be juxtaposing the situation there with back in Australia, and I would talk about that this is why the rule of law matters and democracy matters, and I said I come from a country where the per capita GDP is this, and so I'm throwing that sort of back at them, to say, look, you guys are totally on the wrong track.
I could imagine being the interrogator wanting a snippet, and you're going off on a tangent, and you'd be sitting there going, God, shut up. So I can understand that's your little form of revenge. A couple of the interrogators you gave names for. Do you want to give the different styles of interrogation that you faced and the different personalities?
Sure do, mate. Yeah. So there was a bit of bad cop, good cop routine going.
That's another thing we learn in the academy.
But my names for them were pretty basic because I should say at no point did they ever identify themselves. Not only by not telling me what their names were, but who they even represented. I didn't know at any one point, was I talking to a detective? Was I talking to a military guy? Certainly the worst I could tell straight away were the military guys. So I just invented some names for one of them. And again, just shows how unoriginal I am. One of the guys used to always wear a leather jacket, so I called him Leather Jacket. And then one of them, though, a guy who was both an interrogator and an interpreter, I used to call him the Terrateur, just to merge the two.
Two words.
Yeah, and I really didn't like him. He was a guy who sort of falsely tried to be my friend at various points.
Yeah.
But if anything, I held him more to account than the others because his English was really good. He told me he'd been educated in Singapore. I don't know if that's true or not, but he had a worldliness about him that the others didn't have, and so I always thought, you should know better than to be part of this.
So you're judging him. He wasn't living in the bubble. He had a broader worldview.
Absolutely, and he knew. I knew that he knew what he was doing was wrong.
Yeah. I like that. That's again a little victory. I know you know.
Yeah.
What's going through your mind? Like 2 months locked in this box. How do you survive that time?
Yeah, so
and keep your sanity, not just lose it and just give up all hope.
Absolutely, mate. So two main strategies. The first, the most basic, and the first things that you go to, and probably I think this makes sense for us all. Right? The first thing you do as a sentient being, a thinking being, is that you want to move, even in the most confined spaces. So the first thing I did was just to pace, walk up and down. But I developed a routine, and the routine really helps calm your mind down. So I would walk from one wall to another, touch the wall, made sure I touch. And if I didn't touch, I'd have to do it again.
So you got rules that you had to...
Had rules, and above all, I would count. And the important thing about counting is it occupies your mind. Particularly if you're doing it quickly, you can't really think of too much else because you've got to keep the count. So I worked out that it was 8 paces from one wall to the other, and then I thought, the healthy day average of steps they recommend is 10,000.
You're doing your step count.
I'm doing my step count. So I thought, I've got to, by the end of the day, I must have done 1,250 laps of the cell.
Yeah.
So I would very rigorously count the number of steps. And if we got interrupted, if one of the interrogators come in, I'd then be chained to the chair, and I'd have to answer questions. But I would keep the number in my head and then restart the count.
So keeping your mind active.
Yep. And I think also psychologically have control over time and space, because I think that's, when you lose control, lose any sense of agency, it's a way of just sort of making the world sort of vaguely understandable and categorised and so on.
Have some purpose. We had a guest on the podcast, Bernie Matthews, and he spent a long time in solitary confinement, and this is in the bad old days of the prison system, where it was black, just a black cell, no light. Months he spent in there, and he said the only way, one of the things that kept him sane was he found a button. In the cell, there was a button. So a game that he would play in the pitch black would throw the button and then see how long, he knew it'd be in the cell somewhere, and see how long it took him to find it. Sometimes it might take a day, other times he might find it in the first 10 minutes, but that kept his mind occupied. But I'm fascinated by the resilience of people in those situations, because your mind must have been playing so many tricks on you.
Absolutely. And that story really resonates with me, Gary, because I never had that, but I would use imperfections and like within the cell to sort of invent stories and see pictures. Yeah. And I remember that there was distinctly paint splashes on the floor, and they were red, white and black. Yeah. And one of them just looked like a Manchester United player kicking a goal.
Okay,
you could see, like, it was like an abstract painting.
Yeah.
And I remember, and I think I've got this in the book, right? There was also, I could see a Dr. Seuss character with that big hat on, the red and white hat. I remember seeing that. So I'd do that. Then I'd invent games as well. So I'm a big fan of US history. I love, American history, but particularly American political history. So one of the things I tried to do was remember all of the US presidents in order. And it took me a long time to do. And then later I was able to check. So I got them all out, I thought, and then later on, many months later when I got the books, I was able to check. But so I did that, naming the US states, Australian prime ministers, all this sort of stuff. So it really gave myself, something to think about.
Yeah. So that's just a process to keep your mind active and keep your sanity, I suppose.
Exactly, mate. So just and keep the thoughts at bay is the most important thing to do. Otherwise, you start to descend into panic. Yeah.
I could imagine that be an overwhelming feeling. We've talked about psychology. What about the physical side of things? Your health, it's not conducive to good health being out of natural sunlight for that long. I wouldn't imagine the meals were overly nutritious. How'd you survive health-wise?
Both of those things were a real problem. When I finally came out after 2 months, my skin was incredibly white, but unhealthily white, scaly, because I was sort of living on this concrete floor. The food was really bad, and you often get food poisoning from it. And so I lost 10 kilos. So I wasn't fat going in. I was about 55 kilos going in. And when I was taken out, I was about 45 kilos.
Okay, so you stripped a lot off.
Absolutely. And I looked gaunt. And of course, by then my hair was sort of long and grey. And I just looked awful.
I suppose you didn't have a mirror in there to
no, that's true.
Tidy yourself up. What about sleeping? Could you sleep?
Surprisingly, sleep was better than I thought. Funnily enough, because I think again, even though I did the pacing, which was some exercise, but it wasn't a normal sort of physical workout that I would do, anywhere else. But I was tired, I think, from the mental exhaustion, and yeah, the sleep there was surprisingly okay. The biggest problem, of course, was the lights were on all the time. But I did have a little eye mask from the plane that
Yeah.
I would put on. Sleep wasn't too bad. The biggest problem with sleep was being interrupted by the interrogators because, again, they would come in at any time.
Yeah.
And of course, you didn't know how, and so I had no clock or anything like that. So I didn't know how long I'd been asleep. So sometimes they would wake me up and I wouldn't know, if I'd been
Sure, if
asleep
it's a
for an
morning
hour.
yeah.
Or 8 hours or whatever. So so it was problematic in that way. But I think mental exhaustion meant that sleep was sort of better there than it was when I was a bit safer, where my mind sort of would play on things.
Okay. Did you have any idea? Did anyone give you an indication how long you might be there for? Because that would be someone that's able to control their life and an economist. There'd be a lot of structure to your life, I would imagine. Did you, it's a military coup. Could I be forgotten about and left in here for years? That would be running through my mind.
Totally, mate. And then as the weeks went on, that became a dominant thought.
Yeah.
Because, by then the idea that I might be just quickly released, given a fright, etc., and then released, that's beginning to go.
Yeah.
And I started to think about all the things that could go wrong, because I could hear explosions and gunshots going on outside. And I'm just thinking, what if this place just descends completely into chaos? And here I am just trapped here. I'm trussed up in this place. I've got no power. I've got no ability to defend myself or anything like that.
Yeah.
I mean, my physicality is such, I'm a little bit over about 150 centimetres.
Yeah.
And 40 odd kilos by this time. So there's not much I could have done.
Well, so you say, if you're not a spy and highly trained assassin.
This is true.
We
I keep
don't
forgetting.
know. It's not by chance you're here on I Catch Killers. We're going to get to the bottom of this story. Look, Sean, that might be a good time to take a break because this is just the start of Sean's excellent adventure. When we get back, we'll talk about when you were moved to when we say insane prison, that is probably an apt term for it, but that is the actual name of the prison. Your court matter, your transfer, and how you survived going from your box environment into a prison environment. And I just think it's fascinating. So we'll be back shortly.